It's a couple of things. I want to first leave room to for you to ask anything about Walzer and Altman and Wellman that you don't understand if I haven't covered it yet. But then I want to take a step back and look at different ways in which Walzer, Altman and Wellman, and Tesson, who you've hopefully also read for today, look at self-determination, and then look a little closer at some of Tesson's arguments. But first, does anyone have anything you want to address about Walzer, Altman, and Wellman? Yeah, Claudia.
I actually thought about them, but I didn't quite understand what the religion myth was. Are you going to talk about that later?
Yes, yes, we will.
So Walzer's definition of self-determination, does it include it being a fit in society or something? I mean, between the state and society?
Yeah, so this Walzer's view, does it include Walzer's view of self-determination include fit between state and society? Yeah, that's ultimately what he thinks self-determination is about, right? Like a state or a country or a society is self-determining when that fit between the people or its society and its history and so on, and the way it's being governed, when that fit exists. And when that fit gets broken, that's when he thinks self-determination breaks down. So that's ultimately how these exception cases where intervention becomes allowed for him make sense, and why in other cases it intervention is not allowed. Right? Because he thinks outsiders coming in and changing things, that breaks the fit, because it's the outsiders that are replacing the actual history with a different one.
That's all they want to fit with people.
Right. Well, that's one way. Other ways would be it can be broken from the inside too, but things have to get pretty badly out of whack, right? So if there is like an enormous bloodshed going on where you have just a violent dictator who's just starting to slaughter his people, then there is no fit, he says. If you have this kind of protracted civil war where you have two sides and one is not really beating the other, and it looks like you have two different groups that are forced within a same country, then there is no one thing that's fitting, you know.
And then about Altman and Wellman. Wait, so Walzer's definition also deals with human rights violations. And then
that's one, right? So if there's this slaughtering going on, then there are severe human rights violations, and then intervention becomes okay or allowed because self-determination is gone. But for him, it's not necessarily about the human rights violations. It's because the human rights violations are a symptom, like they're evidence that the fit is broken. So in other cases where there are no human rights violations, it could still be that there is no fit if the people ask for foreign intervention. So that's another case where if the people say, hey, outside power, we want you to take over, and the government doesn't want it, then intervention can still be allowed, Walzer thinks.
And that's what Altman and Wellman mainly focus on, the human rights violations.
Right.
That they can carry out self-determination as long as those rights aren't being violated.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, Altman and Wellman focus more on the human rights violations, and that's their attempt to get what they call the value individualism into the theory. Right? They say like self-determination is a collective good, but it only makes sense if we think about it in terms of what it means for individuals, and how do we make sure that it always is valuable or good for individuals? Well, by making sure that self-determination can never violate their rights. And that would be the human rights. Well, we've seen, right, he goes back and forth, right? So at some points he seems to say, well, it's the rights of the individual people, but then at other times it becomes the fit of the entire society, and it just, I think ultimately it's unclear. So what you then have to do, right, as a reader, as a good philosophy reader, is you try to construct what you think the best version of the view is. And if you can't get both of the individualism and the collectivism together in one view, then you have to think, well, what makes the most sense reading this thing in a way that does fit, or is coherent. You have to make up your own mind for that. I want someone. Did you have a? Is that right? One thing I wanted to call your attention to is, I don't know if people have the Altman and Wellman book with them, but if you do, open it up at page 1415. Just want to draw your attention to a passage there. just because in the first class, excuse me, we talked a little bit about method and the way in which Altman and Wellman do philosophy. And there's like pages 14 to 16, you can see Altman and Wellman doing this very clearly. And if you remember, the method was this, with an expensive word called reflective equilibrium, but it's basically the idea of trying to come up with a view that has principles, sort of abstract basic principles, leading to certain implications or conclusions in practice, where the two are consistent with one another, and if you can't have everything, you try to make sort of the overall mix of principles and implications or conclusions that you think is overall best. So you're going to go back and forth, right? You can test a principle that looks really good as a principle by looking at what type of conclusions do they allow for, and then going back the other way, you can say, well, this seems like the right conclusion to me, but if I'm going to say that, then I have to accept this kind of principle, and that principle looks really bad, and then so that's a way in which you can see which of your conclusions or which of your principles you can really keep together. Right? And so on 14, 15, 16, you see Altman and Wellman doing that very clearly. They start talking about, on 14, about a couple of thought experiments. And they're doing the same as we talked about last time that Walzer does, right? It's like these are stylized examples in which they try to abstract away as much as possible of sort of the messiness of the real world to focus in on the idea about self-determination. Okay? And so they talk about forcible annexation of the U.S., sort of Canada by the U.S., right? So they say, like, the United States can annex Canada against the will of the Canadian people, 90% of whom oppose annexation. But it goes peacefully, right? So peacefully, so no one gets killed and so on in the process. And they acquiesce in their new status, so they're not resisting, and there's not civil war that breaks out and so on. Also, imagine that the Canadians enjoy better protection of their human rights, right? So things get, it's the same structure as the Walzer example, right? And they say, what's still wrong? So this is they basically reproduce Walzer's thought experiment. And then later they have later on 15, they do a similar thing with a colonized country and an imperial country that is doing the colonizing. And they say, well, in those cases, the colonization is wrong, parallel to the case of Canada and the United States. Now, earlier, they've given you two principles, right? So on page 13, they've given you the two principles of political self-determination that they defend. And then as they go on through these thought experiments, they say, well, these sort of seem intuitively, when we look at these thought experiments, the right thing to say seems to be that the colonized country is being wronged by imperium, and Canada would be wronged by the United States. And actually, if we accept these two principles here, then we can accept those conclusions too. So, on top of 16 here, right? They say, accordingly, we claim that our principles of political self-determination cohere well with and help explain important considered convictions relating to colonialism and forced annexation. So that's explicitly them using that method, right? So we have principles. We like those principles because they make sense of the individualism that they've accepted already. So good principles. But they also cohere with and help explain the considered convictions or the conclusions that seem right. And then they say that's a good argument for their theory. Right? So theory has good principles leading to good conclusions, like intuitively plausible conclusions. And so the argument now is, like, if you're going to disagree with us, then it looks like you're going to have to ditch either some of the appealing principles or some of the appealing conclusions, and that's going to be a problem unless you have some very powerful arguments. All right? Later on in the book, they'll continue to use this type of method, but they won't signal it as clearly as they do here, especially on 16. So I just wanted to draw your attention to it. This is the clearest case of that type of method that you'll see, and it's the method that we'll be using throughout term. All right. Anyone, any questions before we move on? All right. Good. All right, so let's go on to these different kinds of self-determination. Okay. So with Tassan, we've seen a very different view from, well, especially Walzer, but also different from Altman and Wellman. All three disagree with one another. So here's three different ways you might think about the value of collectives, right? the way in which self-determination, the thing we're talking about, which is something that states, nations, and groups or whatever do, right? 3 different ways you might think about the value of what is happening in these groups, or these groups themselves, or these states, these entities, these collectives. Right? So here's a one. These are just my terms. I'm making this up myself. They call it robust collectivism. This is kind of the view that Hegel holds, right? And maybe on some moods, Walzer. Right? That's, if you read him this way, then Walzer would hold this too. And the idea is that collectives have independent moral value. So in the Tassan reading, you will have read a quote from Hegel, which is the clearest statement of that view. Right? The state has a real personality, a will, autonomy, rationality, value. Right? That's a thing that exists, the state, and that thing matters. If it's lost or harmed or something, then that, independent of anything else that might happen, is a bad thing. It has rights. Right? We might have obligations towards it. All right. That is, of course, the thing that Altman and Wellman, and you'll have seen, especially Tassan, reject. So here is what Tassan says: robust individualism. We'll call it maybe thought it was exclusive. It changed anyway. It's the opposite, which is that only individuals can have moral value. This is definitely what Tassan holds. Tassan thinks, especially in his final pages of the reading that I hope you've looked at for today, he says stuff like, well, look, this is all BS. It is a mistake to think that states can have a will or have autonomy or have freedom in any sense that matters. Only individuals can do that. Only individuals can enjoy rights. Only individuals matter. Like everything else doesn't matter. So that's like an extreme version of individualism. And then here's a kind of what I'm calling a hybrid individualism. This is, I think, what, if we really take a step back, what Altman and Wellman are saying. It might seem that what Altman and Wellman are saying is this, but it's not really what they're saying. They say individuals are the ultimate source of value. So, if you remember two classes ago, we talked about problems about like things like animal rights or the value of the environment and so on for Altman and Wellman. And their view, we said, has to be, it's not just that these things, they're not committed to saying these things don't have value or they cannot have value. Right? What they have to say is that if they have value because they have value for human beings. Right? And that's ultimately the source. So all these things have derivative values and like they go back to. So Altman and Wellman do think that collective self-determination, the thing that groups do or nations do or states do, matters. But it just has to be sort of translated back to individuals. It has to be built up out of individual values. And it's different from this, right? This is only individual. This is the strongest version. And at times, Tassan seems to help himself to that. So this is a kind of a mixed, right? It's like allows for collective values, but only if they're properly based on individual stuff. This doesn't allow for collective values at all, right? It's just like these collectives have no value other than the individuals that make up these collectives. Right? So we have a classroom here, right? If you're a full-blown, robust, or exclusive, or extreme individualist, you say, if we think about what ethically is going on here as a classroom, like there is just you, and there's you, and there's you, and there's you, and you, and me, and when we've like named all these things that have value, everything that matters has been named. And that's not true on this type of view. Definitely not true in this collectivist view, right? Because there the class as a whole might matter as well, or the group, if the group is the right kind. Maybe by the end of term we get there. Right? But on this version, right, you might say, well, there's you, 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 and then there's also what we together can be, because that matters for us as individuals or something. Right? But that's an additional story that we're telling. It's a layer on top. Right? Whereas on this view, there was nothing more to be said. We said everything after we mentioned all the individuals. Okay?
What's the difference between hybrid individualism and robust collectivism?
So in the robust collectivism, collectives have value, like in the hybrid individualism case. But in the collectivist case, you don't have to translate that back to the value that it has for individuals. So it can just these collectives, like this is what Hegel seems to have held, right? That the state itself is a source of value. So you might think, this is getting a little foundational maybe, but you might think like, what's the phrasing? So John Rawls is one of the most famous 20th century political philosophers. He had this phrase, he had a knack for a good turn of phrase, but he had this, not quite sure if this is verbatim, but it's close enough. He said, individuals are self-authenticating sources of claims. Sounds good, right? Anyway, the point being, sort of like if you think, well, where do like ethical values come from? Something like this idea here, right? The idea is like why should I care about ethics at all? Like why are certain things right and wrong? And his idea is, well, it starts with just individual people, right? And so you're a source of claims, like rights against me, things that I have to do or forbear, right? So I can like swing my arm, right? And then I can swing my arm and walk, right? Until I get too close to you where I would hit you, right? And then I can't swing my arm ethically anymore. And why? Well, because I would punch you. That violates your rights not to be punched. Okay, why do I care about that? Well, because I should care about you, right? As much as my son? No, not as much as my son, right? But I should still care about you at least as the kind of person that I shouldn't be beating up just for fun or something, right? Just to make a point. So, right, and so the idea here then is like, where does that come from? Well, just you being a person, right? And so on this hybrid view, that's in the background, right? So that ultimately if I wonder like, why should I care about the state? Well, it's not because the state is like just like you, something that when I encounter it is just there and it's commanding my respect, right? Such that I change my behavior when I come too close to it or something. So the state is not like that, right? But you are like that, and so if I can tell a story about how the state matters for people like you and others, right? Not just you, but other people too, well, then that's good enough, right? So then I can tell a story about why the state matters. But on this full-blown collectivism, what Hegel seems to have thought, not to get into Hegel exegesis too much, but what Hegel seems to have thought is, you are the kind of thing that I should change my behavior towards, like swinging my arm, but also a whole bunch of other stuff. But the state is also like that. And I don't have to tell a further story, right? The state itself has this standing where value comes from. And that's very different. That's definitely something that Altman and Wellman want to reject, right? So that's what they think is the beginning of the liberal theories, that you say no to that. Is that you say only the individual people are entities that have these type of claims. All right, so here's sort of roughly, here I changed it to exclusive. Okay. Just to give you a little map, right? So here are these principles. Here I changed it to exclusive, but it doesn't really matter. I'm making up these terms anyway. And so you can ask, like, what does that mean for self-determination and human rights violations? So collective self-determination, can it be compatible with individual human rights violations? This is sort of how it goes, right? And there are your authors. I'm putting Walzer between parentheses because it's not always clear what he's saying, right? And part of that is because he says things that sound value individualist, right? So, and it seem like individualist in the sense of, well, you would have to say something like no or limited, but he doesn't. Right? He allows quite significant, so that's the tension. Right? Tamir?
So with collectivism, I get that the collectives can have an independent moral value, but the individuals themselves, in comparison, is their value just less, or is it equally as much as the states?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, so what about the individuals in the collectivist theory? It's going to depend who you ask, right? So there's different possible versions of collectivism. You might think of at least 3 possible versions. One would be the individual also has value, even more, right, than the state. Or you might think that it's equal, right? Like individuals have equal value to the state. Or there is the more scary version, maybe, which is that the state has more value than the individuals. Traditionally, sort of your standard Mussolini-style fascist theory, right? Held that the state or the nation had more value than the individuals that make up the state, because it's greater and blah blah blah. It's the force of history throughout, and you get all these romantic theories that kick in at that point. For Hegel, I think it's at least a higher kind of value. So usually people who say things that like that collectives can have value like the state, they say that in order to make a point that sometimes individuals can be sacrificed or have their rights at least compromised for the greater good, right, or the whole or the entity. And if you're going to say those things, then you're going to have to say it's more. But just by saying that collectives can have independent moral value, you're not committing yourself to that. That's why I'm sketching these three possible views. But most people who say that say more, in sort of omelette and breaking eggs type style. Does that help? Okay. All right. So this is just sort of the landscape, right? These are the possible the views that we've seen. So far, so good? Okay. All right. So here's the Hegelian myth. Hopefully you knew it for today. So on the first page of Tesson's reading, he says it's the moral personality of the state, right? So the idea is basically that the Hegelian myth, this is what Hegel believes, or Tesson at least claims that he believes, is that the state is a moral entity with rights, responsibilities, obligations, and so on of its own. Autonomy, rationality, a will, a consciousness even. Hegel will talk about those things. Next week, after the exam, we'll start talking about Rousseau. Rousseau thinks that the community or the government, the state, democratic polity can have a will of its own. He talks about sovereignty as the moral personality of the community as well. So that is all part of what Tesson is calling the Hegelian myth. Claudia, did that address your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Is that what you got out of it too, or not?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So there is an analogy here, right? This is one that Tesson jumps on and tries to attack. We'll get to that more. But there's an analogy between the state or the community and individual persons. So you as an individual can be self-determining in the sense of being autonomous, making up your own mind, arranging your own affairs, having a will, having a rationality, having a and so on. And all those things that you as a person have, they appear at the level of the state too. And there's something to be said for this, right? Like we talk often in the news, for example, as if that's the case, right? Today, Russia, launched airstrikes in Syria. Russia did that, right? We're talking about Russia as an agent. All sorts of things like that. The EU is trying to enter into trade negotiations with Japan. Or something, right? So say Japan and the EU as if we're talking, and they can have an agreement, right? And they want something, right? The Japan wants more concessions from the EU in these negotiations, something like that. Like they have a desire, they have a plan, right? Well, we talk a lot about these in these terms, right? And so the Hegelian views takes that very seriously, that talk. Doesn't think it's just metaphor or just sort of shortcuts to talk about complicated processes in an easy way. Takes that literally. So, well, there's that thing Japan, and there's that thing Russia, and there's that thing Syria, and then those things are interacting as if they're entities or agents. Right? Okay. So Tesson will have none of this. Right? He thinks it's a myth, right? And so by a myth means it's a mistake, it's a fairy tale, something you might believe in but ought not to believe in because it's not real. So two versions. There's this robustly collectivist version based on an analogy with individual autonomy, like I've just been talking about. And then there is an individualist version, which is where it would be this self-determination would be directly based on the individual autonomy of the citizens, right? So if the U.S. has, as a whole, standing as a state, as it has rights, has a consciousness, has a rationality, then that can be understood in terms of ours, right? You, me, every individual person. So it sort of scales up and then something new appears out of those individual cases. So those are the two versions that he discusses. All right. So first, the collectivist reading. So it gives two objections to this. One is a conceptual objection, the other is a substantive objection. You're being way too quiet, so I'm going to ask you, what's a conceptual objection? Or what's Tessant's conceptual objection? Does anyone have any? All right, step back. What's a concept? Anyone have an idea what a concept is? I'm not going to pin you down too much. Yeah, an ID? Right, good. Yeah, an idea or sort of like an abstract thought or something, right? ID itself is a concept, right?
Right.
Okay, right.
I guess an objection is going against that idea. Conceptual objection. Not agreeing with somebody else's concept.
Yeah, right. So someone is using a concept or an abstract thought or term, and then if you use a conceptual objection, and an objection being an argument against it, you're saying they're abusing or they're misusing or misapplying the concept or the idea of the term. Right? Anthony?
I would think like a conceptual objection would be like using like a thought, like a thought process to where you come up with, I think the Swedish and Algerian one would be considered a conceptual objection, because they come up with like an abstract thought to play out, and the substantive would be like the hard facts of like math and like just straight logic.
Yeah, good. I don't think that's exactly right on what at least the way that Tessant is using them. But the basic way you're thinking about it is definitely correct, which is this is going to be a more abstract version of an objection, where this is going to be a more concrete or applied version. Right? So in case of Tessant, what he's saying is first is a conceptual, just thinks that the basic terms or ideas are misused by the Hegelian thinker, whether it's Rousseau or Hegel, maybe Walzer. And then there's a substantive objection that's going to be more theoretically motivated. Right? You say, well, here's an argument, like a substantive, like I'm going to make some assumptions or claims, and if you take these claims or assumptions seriously, then there is a problem. So that's still theoretical because we're still doing philosophy, but it is more applied or concrete. All right, so here's the first one, the conceptual, right? So on page 92. The analogy of the state to individual fails because the notions of freedom, autonomy, and equal liberty change their meaning when they are applied to states. What does he mean? Does anyone have any idea what he means? What's the point of saying this against the Hegelian? It's an objection, right? The Hegelian is supposed to be like, uh-oh, problem. What's the problem supposed to be? Right? Good, yes. So they misunderstood what was being said when, what were we saying? What's the thing they misunderstood? So okay, so I'm going to be the Hegelian, right? Then you tell me what I'm misunderstanding. Right? The state is a free, autonomous, rational being with value. What's
that it's the state itself that's free and rational.
good? And so why would I be worried about words changing their meaning or something? One was there. Yeah, good. So, yeah, we have to take if this analogy is going to work, right? If we're going to say that when I say this about the state, the implications about it are being like moral status are just the same as with individuals, where we do accept, well, rational, conscious, free, and so on, gives us moral status. Well, then these words have to be relevantly similar, right? And he says they change their meaning, so he thinks these cannot be applied to the state in the relevant way. So something has gone awry, right? We might say, well, actually, the state is a free state or something, but it's a different we mean something different when we say free state than when we say free person. Or we say the state is autonomous. We don't really say that anyway, he thinks, right? That's tortured use of language, probably a little pedantic at best, right? And we do say an autonomous individual. Say all people have equal freedom or equal liberty, or ought to have equal liberty or equal freedom. We say, well, we'll say that sometimes as a principle or an ideal. We say all countries have that. He says, no, not really. He has a footnote. He says, tellingly, when we talk about countries being like a free state, we actually talk about them as a place in which human rights, the individual human rights are being respected, not they are free to order their affairs or something. Claudia, I saw your hand up a second ago.
I think at some point you said that autonomy just itself is wrong in the context of state because autonomy-based rights are rights against the state, so you can't say it's an autonomous state because that would just then just be a logical.
Yeah, good. I'll get to that in a moment. So that's a more substantive argument, right? Because now we're going to say something about what autonomy means and how it might be claimed against the state, and that there might be a logical problem. The first objection is a more simple one, actually. You just say, like, well, when we say the autonomy of states, we're referring to something different than when we say the autonomy of you. Okay? And if the autonomy of you has a certain implication, we cannot assume that when we talk about the autonomy of states that it has the same implication, because it means something different. And so, this sounds right, but something subtle, a subtle shift in meaning has happened. So when I was saying earlier, right, about how we use these things in the news, Japan wants to enter into a treaty with some other, Korea or whatever, right? Wants to, right? When we say, well, I want to get some ice cream after class or something, right? Like that means one thing when I say I want that. It's a desire that I have. But when we say Japan wants to enter into, like we're saying something about Japan, we might say something about desire, but it's not the same type of desire. Right? And so we cannot just draw any conclusions from that analogy. That's a faulty argument. You convinced by that? Anyone worrying about this? Ryan?
Go ahead. You got it. I don't think the problem with saying that really rests on, the being a false analogy, more so as it's just when we say something, we don't always mean literally what we say. Like we mean something else. So when we say Japan wants to do what X, what we're saying by that is the individuals who are calling the shots in Japan want said thing. That's the same way we use the language. A semi hit, a compact car on the highway. Well, the semi didn't, do anything. It was only two senses. The vehicle to which the driver, made said action.
Right. Yes, I think Tassan would like what you're saying now, right? You're saying like these are, it's like a shorthand for what's really going on.
Yeah.
And then, so he's saying against. So remember, right? This is an objection that the Hegelian is supposed to worry about. If the Hegelian is saying the state has the capacity to make choices, and anything that can make choices has moral standing, then your objection would be something like, well, it's just a figure of speech, really, right? It's a shorthand for a much more complex process in which there is a political process in Japan such that the people who influence it the most have made decisions such that lead to this treaty being taken. So, but that's really, that's probably still too short, right? But it's already cumbersome, so we just say Japan chooses to. And, right. But then, if it's something very different, then you can't assume that the same conclusion about moral standing follows. It has to be defended on its own. So Tassan would say. Are we on the same page? Or no?
I was thinking about something. I'm sorry. I'm distracted. Earlier, you just casually said when he had said something that a right was a claim against, your arm example, that he had a claim against you for that. And you just casually said something that was actually, I think it's very profound, because a lot follows from that. If you're saying his right is a claim against you, that has, and you just provided a definition of a right, being that a right is a claim against another.
Yeah, that's just, well, in the standard analysis of rights, there are, rights can be four different kinds of things. If you take philosophy of law, for example, you'll learn this. This goes to someone called Hofeld. But one version, the most important version, is the claim. And then the idea of a claim is, a right is a claim when your right imposes a duty on other people to do something. So he has a right against me that I don't punch him, and that's a claim against me, meaning I have a duty not to punch him.
That makes
So,
sense. That's
right.
why lightning striking you isn't taking away your right to life.
Right, because you can't have any claims against forces of nature. Right. And forces of nature are not subject to duties, so it doesn't break down. All right, Jeff, you had a point a moment ago.
So no, he pretty much got it as far as the state wanting to or needing to do something.
Okay. All right. So Toussaint admits that these type of conceptual objections, they have their value, but they're also fairly easy to get around always. The standard, when philosophers make conceptual objections, you can always get around it this way, right? So the Hegelian could say, okay, well then what the state has is not really freedom or autonomy or liberty or consciousness, but they have something that's similar to it. It has just the same value, right? The same importance. It's a different thing with the same importance. Just call it something. We'll come up with a different word, right? Call it freedom, greedom, right? Whatever, like the next letter in the alphabet or something. Be-autonomy or something. Right? So, and then now you have no argument anymore, right? Because now you're saying, well, I was complaining about you using the same word, but now I'm using different words, so big deal, right? So he adds it with a substantive objection. This is a more interesting theoretical objection. Here it goes. This is over 93, 94. It says, only persons can pursue, are capable of that, right? Like only persons can do this, pursue rational ends and be autonomous in a moral sense. And we indeed have a moral duty not to interfere with their choices, unless those choices violate someone else's rights. But states are not persons. Okay? So there's a different entity. They don't pursue rational ends in a moral sense. Right? The rulers of the state, that would be, are agents of the people. Therefore, they do not hold, qua government, as a government, any independent right of autonomy. States are valuable only derivatively. They have worth only if they serve the interests of the individuals. State autonomy is philosophically grounded on and subordinated to individual autonomy as human rights. So what he's doing here, this is like your hardcore value individualism, right? He's saying, look, that's the only thing that matters. And if a state is going to matter at all, if a collective can have matter, it can only have that one subordinate to the individual rights. So maybe it's not the hardcore exclusive, but it's pretty close. Right?
How do you describe a substantive objection?
So that would be an objection that relies on some substantive principle or assumption. Right? So the conceptual objection is an objection that relies on the meaning of concepts. It would be the meaning of freedom or autonomy or something. And the substantive one is going to rely on some type of theory or idea. And here that would be this idea that only persons can have this moral value or this pursue rational ends that be autonomous in a moral sense. That's a substantive claim, right? You can deny that. Right? You can say, well, actually, I have a different theory that says blah, 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 right? It's different from that. So, but if you agree with this, Toussaint says, then all the other points follow. So the state really has no independent value of its own. It's only derivatively. All right. So this will be the last time I do this term, but just like quickly, since not everyone here has philosophical background, this should be, maybe this is too obvious for you, I don't know. But this is how, what is Toussaint doing here, right? So here is a version of the Hegelian argument. So just a simple two-premise argument. If an entity, something, a person or a state or a collective or whatever it might be, right, has moral standing, is autonomous, etc., then it has a right to arrange its own affairs or self-determination, right? States have this kind of moral standing, are autonomous, etc. Fill in the blanks, right, in your preferred Hegelian fashion. Right? are rational, conscious, your favorite powerful term. Right? And then it follows, right, therefore the states have a right to arrange their own affairs. So that's your standard, most simplified version of the Hegelian argument. This is the Hegelian conclusion, right? The myth that Toussaint wants to defeat. And here's an argument for it, the simple two-premise argument, right? If something has this standing, then it has a right to arrange its own affairs. And actually, states do have that. Right? They are autonomous, they are rational, they are, and so free, etc. These objections here are supposed to attack this argument. This is a sound, or this is a valid argument, right? Meaning, if the first premise and the second premise are both true, then logically, the third claim, the conclusion here follows. Right? So, if you're a rational person, a person who cannot live with contradictions, as you should be, right? Then if you believe one is true and you believe that two is true, you have no choice but to believe that three is also true. No, the philosophers among us know this already, but just to make sure that. Right? So, if you're going to deny 3, this is the reverse of that point. If you're going to deny the Hegelian idea and proclaim it a myth, then one of two things has to be the case, right? Either you have to show that it's actually not a logically valid argument, that there is a logical mistake in here. You're not going to. That's not going to happen. It's valid. Trust me. Okay. Other option: claim that either the first or the second premise actually is not true. Right? It's false. It's just a mistake in there. Which one is? Hey, that's what Toussaint is doing, right? Toussaint is attacking the truth of one of these premises. Which one do you think he's attacking? Number 2. Why number 2?
Because it believes that states aren't autonomous and that those only apply to persons, and that this substantive objection.
Right.
And then,
And the conceptual objection is the same way, right? Like, if they have some type of standing autonomy, then it's a different meaning, not in the moral sense, not in the sense that makes it this argument work.
right. Yeah,
Right.
it won't be in the same way. It'll be different.
Right.
Different conception.
Right. So, in this sort of imaginary simplified argument, Toussaint is saying the second premise is false. And if the second premise is false, then you cannot conclude that the third must also be true. Okay? Right. That's just some very rudimentary philosophical method. Mike, you had your hand up a second ago. Yeah? Okay. All right. So, denies the truth of premise 2. All right. Second, here's the individualist reading. Right? So there's an individualist reading of self-determination. The collectivist was, there's just this thing, the state, and it has the relevant characteristics of autonomy, rationality, and so on, to give it moral standing. That was the first. The second is this individualist, right? Which is that the individual autonomies of all the citizens together translate or make up this higher thing, the state, that also has value now, but the value is the result of the individual. It's just built up. So you have all these individual autonomies. They combine in a certain way. Presto, new thing happens. Right? That's sort of the caricature version of the theory. And here's Toussaint's critique. Right? So individual autonomy is not centrally anchored in a supposed right to have a state ruled by fellow citizens, no matter how abusively. Rather, individual autonomy is intrinsic to the notion of human rights. Autonomy-based rights are rights against the state, not to a state. Claudia, I think this is what you had in mind earlier. So, question: what's the argument here? Someone want to try? I like that you're talking a lot, but I want other people to talk as much, so I'm not trying to take you down. I'm trying to take others up. Anyone else? There's too much silence in this room, so much that the devilish side of me is starting to think of calling on people. So you don't want that. What's the idea here? Like, what's the point that he's making? Yeah, right.
That autonomy is based
Yeah, so the theory that we have in mind now is the state has value, right? And that's value separate from your value and my value. How come, right? Well, it's because we as autonomous individuals, we live together in a state, and that gives it that value. Right? And so the objection is what? Can you try again? What's the problem with saying that, according to Tassan?
Wait, was I supposed to say the conclusion?
Well, I was asking what the point of this objection might be. Chantal, you want to try? Right, good. Yeah, so if the state is going to have independent value, Tassan says it cannot be because of the autonomy of individual people. Why? Well, because if you think that, you're not getting what the point of autonomy of individuals is. Right? The point of autonomy of individuals, so these rights are rights against the state, not to a state. Right? So they cannot give the state value that might go against your individual rights and freedoms and so on. Because if you truly think about individual autonomy, that is something that gives rise to or foundation to human rights. And human rights are supposed to protect you against abuse of governments and so on. Right? That's the basic idea here. Reggie?
So is this value...
You're probably not the only one. Yeah.
Is that value individualism, or is it similar, or is it different? Or?
It's a version of it, yeah.
Oh.
Now, this is likely... We'll see later, but well. This individualist reading is not exactly what Altman and Wellman have in mind. Right? Because you remember Altman and Wellman say that self-determination really is something collective. And here, Tassan is considering the theory that self-determination is something that happens just individuals together, side by side. And so we can understand the state's value in terms of individual autonomy, not as something collective. Now, you might wonder, like, well, okay, well, then there's this third version, right? He doesn't address the Altman and Wellman theory. What about that theory? I think what the point you're bringing up correctly here is saying that Tassan thinks, look, if you really understand what value individualism is, and Altman and Wellman claim to want to take that seriously, right? If you really understand what that is, then you see that there has no collective part to it. There's no collective side to value individualism. Value individualism means taking the individual seriously and protecting him or her from other individuals, but also other collectives. Right? And it's exactly right. And that's going to be so. So Altman and Wellman, you might say, well, but none of your major human rights are being violated. Well, but other rights might be violated. My freedom might be curtailed. So it's not going to. Tassan is still going to think this won't fly, right? If you take individualism seriously, then you take it seriously all the way. So. Yeah, Jeff?
I mean, I might be way off here, but so you could say that self-determination is only an individual right, right? So
if you buy the Tassan idea, you mean?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's exactly what Tassan would say. If you talk about self-determination, you're really talking about the self-determination of a person.
So you have to look at a state or a group as a group of individuals.
Right. Each with their own self-determination, autonomy, rights, freedom. So, yeah.
Okay.
And as soon as the rights of these individuals are being abused, it's just a problem.
The rights of the individuals running the group, or the rights of the individuals that the group is running, or whatever, governing?
Either, right? So any individual, as soon as an individual person has their rights violated, that is a violation of their autonomy, their self-determination.
As an entire group of individuals.
Or as a one person.
One person.
Right.
Okay.
And so if now I'm going to come in, right, let's say that we do the waltzer thing again, right? Like, so I have this magical process, chemical, or maybe something else. In recent work, Tassan uses an example. He calls it the green button example. So like there's a green button here, like, and I can press it. And your rights are being violated or something, and I'll press it, no more rights violation. Right? Nothing else happens, right? Like just like, so don't think about chemicals, or it might sound scary, right? Maybe you shop at Whole Foods, right? You don't like chemicals. So no chemicals, it's a green button, right? And he says, well, should I press it? So now, okay, that's you and me, right? Can I press it? Well, to something, yeah, I can press it. I stop a rights violation. I undo an injustice or wrong. Okay, well now, it's not just you, right? It's someone in Canada, right? Can I press it? And Altman and Wellman or Walter are going to say, no, because the self-determination of the Canadians is going on. Don't interfere. And Tassan thinks, no, I can still press that thing. Because the self-determination that matters is the individual person's self-determination. And so I can protect that person better by pressing the green button. And there is no collective self-determination that blocks that.
So it goes against what Welser and Altman and Wellman think.
Right.
As in you can't interfere with another group. But
right.
What Tassan is saying is we're just a bunch of individuals.
Exactly.
Okay.
So if you want to have the slogan version of Tassan's ID, right, the slogan is there is no such thing as collective self-determination. That's the myth, right?
Okay.
So, Claudia?
But doesn't he say that, I mean, he says it's not your responsibility to do it, but it's not that you don't have permission to do it. Isn't that
right.
what he says? So he does acknowledge that it's actually not, as a foreigner, you don't know exactly what's going on, so you shouldn't do it, but you do still have permission to do it.
Right, so there might be all sorts of reasons not to intervene in other countries, he thinks. But these are all going to be sort of practical, pragmatic reasons. Maybe you don't know. Right? Maybe you're not sure. Probably it's not your business to make sure that all the rights violations in the world stop. You know, like maybe you should just go to your work and be nice to your family or something first. You know? Stuff like that. So you think, oh, fine, fair enough. But none of that has to do with self-determination. So there's never a reason of self-determination to not stop a rights violation. Yeah, Reggie?
Okay, so let me go back a little bit. So that means that's a Gillian myth. Because what I read, what I tried to decipher from it, is at the beginning it was talking about how like you could, I guess if you're in a state, other states could interfere with what you do in your state as far as if you
cannot interfere.
They cannot interfere.
So Hegel thinks absolute non-interference because the state is this moral unit.
So if you're a tyrant, they can do anything to their people or whatever, other states.
More or less, yeah. More or less. And then why? Well, because the state is so important, right? And then that's where Tassan goes off. He says, no, this is all BS, this is nonsense, stop that. All right, so very quickly, here's the argument. We've just talked about it. You can read this on Canvas and stuff, because we only have 1 minute left. Just one note, like all these claims here about autonomy, freedom and individualism and stuff, these are at times assertions, at other times arguments that he gives, right? And so just another pointer for you to get your philosophical antennas going. Whenever you read this thing, you have to ask yourself, like, is he right to say these things? Notice, again, in this trade-off thing, that in the beginning when I pointed you to the method that Altman and Wellman are using, right? If you use that method, now when we look at Tassan, we have to wonder, like, okay, he has what looks like a very strong and in that sense appealing idea of individualism going, and individual human rights as really strong protections of the individual against the state. Sometimes that's what we need exactly. Right? But the implications, the conclusions are going to be pretty radical, right? Because it's going to be that self-determination is going to disappear entirely from the international map, at least as an ethical value. Maybe you find these principles so strongly appealing, Tassan does, right? He thinks these principles are so important that he's willing to live with that implication. But it's a counterintuitive implication. So there is a price to saying these things. Altman and Wellman don't want to go there, so they're willing to weaken these principles, right? They're saying, well, sometimes even though I'm an individualist, your rights can be violated and others cannot have a right to intervene. And so be it. So that's counterintuitive too, right? They just say, well, sometimes you just get screwed. Take it or leave it. So you got to choose for yourself which of these is the better mix. All right. All right. These are questions. You can read these later. We're done time-wise. I'm going to go over these sample questions. This will be posted online, so if you want to look at, just read them and take them on in your own time, feel free to go. Otherwise, I'll go a little later for 5 minutes and just go over them with you if you want to stay. So, anyone of you want to go, or do you want to stay? Okay. All right. So, I'll just get two. These are the multiple choice exam questions. These will be questions that sort of test your understanding or your comprehension of the readings, right? So, we've talked about this. Usually, the topics of these questions will be things that we talked about in the class. I'm not going to just try and lift something from an obscure page or whatever, right? Or a footnote, so you don't have to memorize everything. I want you to get the gist of the ideas of the theories. So, Altman and Wellman insist that their theory is organized as irreducibly collective right to self-determination. Which of these captures it best? Okay. Any ideas? So, groups always have a right to self-determination. Only groups can have a right not to self-determination of individuals. Groups cannot enjoy rights. The right to self-determination is held by individuals. States are wronged when the right to self-determination is violated, not their people. Sorry? B? Yeah. Do you want to explain why?
Said only states can have a right to self-determination because it says they cannot be irreducibly collective. I mean, irreducibly collective. You can't reduce moral rights down to individuals.
Right.
That's what Altman and Wellman think about their self-determination.
Good.
So
Shade, yeah.
groups of people.
Yeah, I was gonna say B too, yeah. But at first I was gonna say A, and then I remember that they can't always have self-determination if the individual's rights are violated.
Exactly. So A is not right because Altman and Wellman have this limit, right? This human rights limit on there. B is the right one, correctly. Because only groups that irreducibly collective, he thinks self-determination is not something individuals have, but only groups. But only some groups, not all groups. Right? Groups cannot enjoy rights. Well, clearly that's not what they think, because they think states and groups can have rights. And states are wronged when the rights are not their people. That has to be wrong too, because as a value individualist, it always has to go down to wronging to the persons, the individual persons.
Yeah, Tasson would probably be perceived.
Yeah, Tasson, that's Tasson's view, exactly. All right? So this is the kind of reasoning. Here's another one. These were both questions from last year's exam, so you won't get them, but it's the same. This is what you should expect. So why does Walzer think that self-determination can be consistent with oppression? So society itself produces the oppression just as it produces other political outcomes. Self-determination requires democracy, and in a democracy people choose the policies. Outsiders cannot judge whether oppression is occurring, because outside interventions always involve the imposition of other views. This is a tricky question in some ways, because a number of these things are things that Walzer does say. The question is, you should ask, is not does Walzer say these things? Is this why self-determination can be consistent with oppression for him? He talked about this. So I'm giving you this one just to make sure that you want to read carefully the question and then carefully the answers, and not just sort of see like, well, the question is about Walzer, I recognize answer A, or B, or C, or whatever, right? And so, bang, that's it. Any thoughts? A? The answer is A, right? We talked about this, right? He does say that outsiders cannot judge whether real oppression is occurring, but that has to do necessarily with why self-determination and oppression aren't mutually inconsistent, right? It's just a point about whether, if you don't know, then you should not interfere, he thinks. It's a different point. Right? Might involve the imposition of other viewpoints, but then we still need to know, well, why is that a problem, right? So it's going to be because self-determination itself is the producing of these political outcomes, and that can be oppressive as well. Right? B, of course, is not right because Walzer does not believe that it requires a democracy to be. All right. Here's the example of an essay question. So this is a question about Walzer and his theory of self-determination. I want you to write an essay in which you address these points, right? So you say something about what for Walzer matters. That's the stuff about culture and history and so on. People feeling like they have a state that they can call their own. Why does it require a non-interference? Well, because interference destroys that value. Then come up with an objection to this. It could be an objection you've seen in the literature. It could be your own. And then some evaluation, right? Like what might he say back? And so this is really where you start thinking independently, I hope. I'm going to give you, like I said, over the next few days, probably tomorrow, I'm going to put on Canvas the outline of the essay question for next week. So you can think about this over the weekend and take your time to prepare what you want to write. Okay? You don't need to sort of do like A, B, C, D, point by point. So here's my answer to the first one. It's just, if you write about the theory, you will write in a way, and you write a good essay about it, you will be addressing these things. Right? So you can do them sort of in the, I'm not going to deduct points if you use a bullet point here and there, but try and write an argued essay. All right. See you next week.